All right, what's up, guys? I hope you're doing well. James here from jamesforsythe.com, and taking a look at delinquency rates. And this is for all kinds of debt. There's a recent blog post by the New York Fed, their Liberty Street Economics. They have an app too, so I'll go straight over to it here. There we go. Let's see. Make sure I got it all up. Yeah, it looks like it. Okay, cool. So they actually have an app for this stuff, which I thought was kind of cool. I downloaded it, and you can see like whenever they post and things like that. But anyways, historically low delinquency rates may be coming to an end, apparently according to recent data. And so basically all forms of consumer debt, it seems, except student loans, increased to a certain degree, obviously varying degrees, but total household debt increased by 312 billion during the second quarter of 2022, and balances are now more than 2 trillion higher than what they were in the fourth quarter of 2019, right? So 3 years ago, before everything happened in March of 2020 and all of that, and we're even 2 trillion above that in consumer debt, or well, household debt, I guess. So all debt types saw sizable increases, with the exception of student loans. Mortgage balances were the biggest driver of the overall increase, climbing 207 billion since the first quarter of 2022. Credit card balances saw a $46 billion increase since the previous quarter, and which reflects rising, wow, reflecting rises in nominal consumption and an increased number of open credit card accounts. Auto loans balances rose by 33 billion as well, right? So keep in mind that this had nominal consumption, right? Keeping it's just the nominal price of things. That's one thing that we'll actually see in the next sentence. That they attribute this to basically higher prices and inflation, right? Which obviously. So in part, the growth of each debt type reflects increased borrowing due to higher prices. Prices for both homes and motor vehicles have been rising, and the borrowing amounts have risen in tandem. In fact, the average dollar amount of new purchase originations of both autos and homes is up 36% since 2019. And this is also reflecting that refinances are down 34% since just this first quarter, right? And so the refinancing has taken a downturn in this, I guess, the first beginning of 2022, and so that kind of makes sense against the backdrop of kind of a, I guess, a boom in real estate, if you want to call it that. Especially the past couple years, um, meaning like 2020 to 2021, and then that took a downturn beginning of 2022, right? And so kind of, yeah. Anyways, I don't know. I had a brain fart for some reason. So the effects of inflation are also visible in credit card balances. The 46 billion dollar increase in credit card balances this quarter was among the largest seen in their data since 1999. And so that's well over 20 years of, I'm surprised they go back that far sometimes. So at least part reflecting inflation on consumer goods and services purchased using credit cards. So Americans are borrowing more, but a big part of the increased borrowing is attributable to higher prices, right? And that's especially what they're using for their credit cards, right? Um, for mine, I mean, like I don't know of many people who use their credit cards to like buy assets and stuff like that. Some people do, but not all of them. Um, Most of the time, credit cards are just used for consumer debt, to where it's like buying, say, like a motorcycle or a boat, or maybe you have to put a new roof on your house, and you kind of have a dedicated credit card for that specifically, or something along those lines, right? And so that's seen the largest increase since the beginning of this century, literally, and millennium, if I could talk. So, although debt balances are growing rapidly, households in general have weathered the pandemic remarkably well, due in no small part to the expansive programs put in place to support them. Further, household debt is overwhelmingly by higher score borrowers, even more so now than it has been in the history of their data. So, one thing I kind of want to comment on with eh, how this has is due to no small part and the expansive programs put in place to support, right? And so it's basically like, okay, but to what degree are they basically just reliant on those programs and people can't stand on their own? Like it's pretty, yes, it was I understand the argument for these programs to begin with, especially given the situation of the pandemic and everything else from 2 years ago. But it's also like, at what point is it like, hey, those need to kind of go away and continue, and people can just go on their own, right? So, what degree is it basically a crutch, and was it too much or not? But those are completely separate questions. So, talking about balances outstanding for, and this is looking at different credit scores, right? And so the light blue is your above 760, and then as you go down, it gets lower, right? So you can tell from mortgages, the vast majority of them, especially in 2022, are from your prime borrowers with a credit score of 760 or above. But when you take out mortgages, this drops significantly to probably about only around 32% ish of the borrowing. So that kind of tells me that the top of the line borrowers, so to speak, um, are mostly with mortgages, right? And so when you put mortgages in there, there's a significant increase in their kind of percentage, right? And that's mostly of balances, but that could also be because, I mean, the debt that you're taking out for houses is significantly more than you would. So, because I'm assuming most people, when they take out auto loans, I mean, it's kind of your typical car or whatever. And so, I mean, there's not that many cars that are worth as much of a house as a house, especially now. Um, I mean, there are some, but those are also like, I don't think they'd be a significant enough degree to really make much of a difference in the grand scheme of things. And so you can kind of see that reflected with the just the size of this light blue portion, right? And so when you take out mortgages, it's more evenly distributed, right? So there's that part. Then you can also see this in uptakes and delinquency transition rates, and this is in total, which we're going to get into the graphs literally now. So you can see this for credit cards and auto loans, which what we have below, and so these rates appear to be resuming a trend in rising delinquencies among subprime borrowers that we had begun to see in 2019 in auto loans, where subprime borrowers retain a non-trivial share of the outstanding balances. And so this kind of makes sense to me because, especially with subprime borrowers being in specifically auto loans, because when I think of subprime borrowers, I'm thinking a little bit like lower income kind of quartiles. And so basically their biggest expenses is going to be their vehicles, right? And they're probably renting houses too. And there's obviously other forms of financing to where they can buy their own home, like FHA, USDA, things like that. But um, I'm thinking they're mostly gonna be in auto loans, and that's kind of their biggest expense, right? And you can kinda see that this is for the delinquency rates, and especially in lower income areas, and so this is separated by zip code, or at least how they're calculating it. So credit card flow into delinquency by zip code income quartile. So you have the first quartile, and it's just taken a huge upturn, and you can also tell that it's shifted up. So I'm assuming this is kind of weighted specifically for lower income. So the first quartile is going to be the bottom, I guess 25% for the lower income parts for lower income areas. And this is also like starts at a higher percentage. And yeah, you can see since 2005, it's still basically at the bottom. Seems like it's just now turning back up to get around 2.5%. And so there's that, but it's starting. Is this the start of a new trend? Kinda like in the very beginning of this year when I was going over, and this video is still up, it's just gonna be a bit further back. I think it was January, or no, mid-February, because it was the monetary policy report, and it was going on about, mortgage rates, and you could see at the very bottom where it had a very similar pattern to where at the time it had a very similar pattern to where it was just starting to kind of bottom and then start to tick up. You had a sharp uptake but we only have like 2 months of data beyond that bottom. And so I was like, it'd be interesting to see if this just like takes off or if it's just kind of a, you know, like all economic data, it doesn't go in a straight line typically. And so if it was something similar to that. But one thing to note is all of these are kind of starting to move up a little bit. So I don't know if that has something to do with kind of overall recessionary talk, which may be reflected in here somehow. Um, I mean, you can argue whether or not we're in a recession or not, but that's a matter of opinion and apparently who tells you what you can know. But anyways, but it's definitely more drastic as you increase the quartiles, right? So as you get to lower and lower incomes, this increase in delinquency rate is going up, is having a higher, we're going to say derivative, I guess, to where the slope of this line is increasing as you go up. So the lower income you have, the faster this rate is increasing, right? And so you kind of see the same story down here with auto loans. So this is credit cards, this is auto loans. And you can also tell that all of these graphs are shifted up. It looks like about half a percentage, more or less. So let's look at now, it looks at late 2021, maybe 2022, because they don't actually have a 2022 here, but this switches every other year, so maybe it is. Talking about the x-axis at least. And so we're looking at the fourth quartile being around 1% ish, or maybe 0.75, and then the first one being around 2 for auto loans, and then at least now. And I guess that wasn't a great way to describe it because you have to kind of overlay these in a way, it seems. Because what I'm looking at is in 2005, the auto loans for the first quartile were 3.5% for delinquency, and then they were just above 2.5 for credit cards. But when you look at the opposite end now, it's basically switched, it seems, to where credit cards are, I think this is it's 2.5% again, so it's back to where it was, but auto loans are coming back up to it looks 2%. So without having the lines going all the way across, sometimes it's hard to tell if it's not like a grid. But so seems like now, or what that would tell me would be people are more delinquent now on credit cards than they are auto loans. But either one is still increasing, right? Or I guess both of them are still increasing. So you have kind of a switch in where people are being delinquent, right? And so you can kind of see this down here for auto loans with this map, which basically shows auto loan delinquency and where it's concentrated, and it's pretty obvious where it's concentrated. And so you have um, the lighter the lighter the shades are about 1%, and then the darker to the red increases to well above 2. And so you can see that throughout the deep south, especially, there's a much higher percentage of delinquency, right, relative to everywhere else in the country. Because you have to keep in mind the highest rate they have on here is 3.7%. And historically, for auto loans, that seems to be more on the high side, right? I mean, and we're going to say between 2008 and 2010 to 11 ish, it was higher than that, but otherwise it's below that. And this is only going back to 2005, so I'd have to just find data going even further back to really make any distinction on that, at least historically. But and this is flow into 30 plus days, so couple months. Oh, past due payments. So basically, people who are over a month late on their car payments, and where they're kind of concentrated is mostly in the deep south, which isn't all too surprising. I mean, I live right there, so just kind of what. And whenever I travel for work, it's pretty much all in this area, like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and a little bit South Carolina, and obviously Florida. But if you pay attention to any of the little things I talk about from my life throughout the videos, they're kind of peppered in there sometimes whenever they're applicable, and so it definitely doesn't surprise me with how much I've gotten around this kind of area of the country. Um, but yeah, it's definitely something to keep in mind and to really pay attention to this recent uptake in delinquencies because it suggests that some households and many communities or individuals are experiencing difficulty economically, right? Which, with inflation being 9.4%, isn't surprising at all. Um, and that's one thing I think you need to keep in mind, specifically with inflation. Like when we're talking about, like I said, 9.4%, that's a rate of change, right? So even if it goes to zero, the actual prices themselves are still higher than they were. It's just they're no longer growing. And so unless it goes negative, the prices aren't actually coming down, right? And so that's one thing you have to keep in mind. I mean, that's more or less, since I don't want to say permanent because obviously they can deflate and come down, but I think the probability of that is not as high as more of just having like disinflation to where the actual rate of increase is coming down. So like maybe it comes from like 9.4 down to like 6 to 5 and maybe eventually getting back down to the Fed's target of 2%. But still, and you kind of have to factor that in here as well because again, they do attribute this to, or they at least attribute a large part of these rises in delinquency rates to being increases in actual prices themselves. So with that being said, obviously I'll put the link to the post itself in the description so you guys can find it and read it yourself if you want to use the charts for anything. Um, it's always a plus. But anyways, I'm going to leave that here. So I hope you guys have a good night, and I will see you on the next one.